Welcome back to the autonomic nervous system. We just finished understanding how white rami and gray rami enable sympathetic nerves that synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglia to get to and from the spinal nerve. The preganglionic cell body, which was sitting in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, sent its axon out into the ventral root of the spinal cord, and this axon then joined with the spinal nerve. This myelinated preganglionic axon then branches away from the spinal nerve and synapses onto the cell body of a postganglionic within a sympathetic chain ganglion. The unmyelinated axon of the postganglionic sympathetic neuron sends a gray ramus to rejoin the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve was, of course, also carrying axons of lower motor neurons, as well as axons of primary sensory neurons, which were located within the dorsal root ganglion. Then, the spinal nerve itself forks into two distinct rami, or branches. The one branch that ultimately heads for the deep muscles of the back, that's called the dorsal ramus, and the branch of the spinal nerve that supplies the anterior of the body wall, that is called the ventral ramus. Both the dorsal and ventral rami are carrying axons of lower motor neurons, which will ultimately synapse onto skeletal muscle fibers, as well as axons of primary sensory neurons, whose cell bodies are located within the dorsal root ganglion. And finally, both the dorsal and ventral rami of the spinal nerve are carrying the axons of the postsynaptic, postganglionic sympathetics, which provide sympathetic innervation to the entire body wall. So now we understand the pathway of sympathetics, which are ultimately bound for the body wall. Preganglionic cell bodies in the lateral horn of the thoracolumbar spinal cord send their axons out into the ventral root of the spinal cord, briefly join the spinal nerve, send a white ramus away from the spinal nerve, synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglion, postsynaptic axon leaves the sympathetic chain ganglion in a gray ramus, rejoins the spinal nerve, and sympathetic fibers distribute between dorsal and ventral rami of spinal nerves to reach targets within the body wall. But we have not explained how sympathetics ultimately innervate visceral structures such as organs contained within the abdomen and pelvis. These are the sympathetic nerves which are not going to synapse in sympathetic chain ganglia. These nerves are going to synapse in prevertebral or pre-aortic ganglia, and the postsynaptic or postganglionic axon will follow the vasculature on the way to the target tissue. So, like always, the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies are located in the lateral horn of the spinal cord between T1 and L2. They send their axons out through the ventral root along with those axons of the lower motor neurons. These preganglionic sympathetic axons briefly join with the spinal nerve before branching off of the spinal nerve and entering into the sympathetic chain ganglion. So this is a myelinated axon which is branching away from the spinal nerve, and so naturally this will be called a white ramus. However, there is a huge difference between what this axon is about to do and that's why we call this axon a splanchnic nerve. What splanchnic nerves do is they roll right on through the sympathetic chain ganglion without synapsing. And that makes sense because what splanchnic nerves are ultimately going to do is synapse onto a vertebral ganglion, and then send postganglionic axons along with the vessels towards sympathetic target tissues. So this splanchnic nerve, which by definition is a preganglionic sympathetic axon, is going to skip through the sympathetic chain ganglion without synapsing. That's because it's going to eventually enter a prevertebral ganglion, for example, the celiac ganglion. It's going to synapse there onto the cell body of a postganglionic sympathetic, and the axon of the postganglionic sympathetic will exit the celiac ganglion, following the vessels out towards visceral organs. So splanchnic is really just a synonym for visceral, and in the context of the sympathetic nervous system, when you're talking about a splanchnic nerve, you're talking about a preganglionic sympathetic axon which exits the ventral root of the spinal cord, briefly joins the spinal nerve, exits the spinal nerve using a white ramus, but continues straight through the sympathetic chain ganglion without a synapse, ultimately synapses in one of the prevertebral ganglia onto a postsynaptic cell which sends its axon, providing sympathetic innervation to the visceral organs of the abdomen and pelvis. As opposed to a sympathetic which exits through the ventral root of the spinal cord, joins the spinal nerve, takes a white ramus to the sympathetic chain ganglion, synapses there, the postganglionic sends a gray ramus back to the spinal nerve, and these axons distribute out towards sympathetic targets within the body wall.